Welcome to the ESS seminar.
You need a glass.
Welcome. We have a few people here. We're very pleased to welcome John Cook today to talk to us about skeptical science, fake news, how to communicate about science, a very important topic. John Cook is from Australia. He moved to the US about a year ago, just before the general election.
No, just a week after inauguration.
And he authored a number of books on communicating climate science and talking about climate change denial. His work was highlighted by President Obama and the Prime Minister of the UK. He developed in 2015 an online course on climate science denial that had 25,000 people enrolled in the class. I've never taught a class with 25,000. That's very cool. John Cook was actually asked to come here by the graduate students of the department. So, Chris, you want to say something about the process?
Sure. So we sent out an email to all the graduate students in our department asking for names of scientists or people that they would want to come talk to us and learn about what they're doing. And we had lots of different names that came in, including Dr. Cook's. And then we sent out a poll of all those names to see, out of those names, who we want to actually come talk to us. And Dr. Cook's name went straight to the top. And so we're glad to have you here.
No pressure.
So sometimes democracy does work.
Okay. With no further ado, John, thank you.
That was tongue-in-cheek, by the way. Thanks very much. I'm really happy to be invited, and it's especially an honour that the students here nominated me. It's an honour, but it also puts a lot of pressure on me to perform, right? So I feel like I have to put a good show on today, and I don't think I've ever spoke to a room quite this crowded either before. So I'm guessing that almost everyone here is a physical scientist, but interested in science communication. So what I want to talk about today is, I guess, the path that I've taken and the lessons that I've learnt as someone coming from a physical science background and having to learn, often against my will, the lessons of science communication, and gradually that leading to choosing a career in social science and researching the science of science communication. So really, my path began in 2007 when I started the Skeptical Science website. And the website was pretty straightforward. The idea was take the most common myths about climate change and debunk them with peer-reviewed science. So I started this as someone, as I said, with a physical science background, but not really knowing anything about science communication. And so, having published this website, I found that I started receiving unsolicited advice on how I could do it better. One person, to give you an example, this is what the website looked like early in its history. I actually grabbed this screen grab relatively recently from the Wayback Machine. I don't know if you're aware of that. It's a website that archives web pages throughout the internet history. Basically, every mistake you've ever done on the internet is being recorded. And so I look back and I cringe at the way that I used to structure the content on my site. So this is an example of debunking a myth about climate change. The headline is the myth, then I repeat the myth again, and then there's a long article debunking the misinformation. And so someone emailed me and said, could you provide a paragraph summary at the top of your debunking so I don't have to read the whole thing? And I emailed back saying, well, if I'd spent all that effort writing the thing, you can damn well spend some time reading it. But I realised that he actually had a good point, and in an ideal world, people would spend hours reading all the text that I spent a lot of effort writing. But in the real world, people often need information quickly, and if they don't get it, then they won't get it at all. So I went through the effort of going through every debunking on the Skeptical Science website and writing a one-paragraph summary rebuttal. So here's a paragraph rebuttal of a particular climate myth. So I was feeling pretty pleased with myself, doing good science communication. Then someone else emailed me and said, well, that's great that you've done this paragraph summary, but could you now do a one-line summary so we don't have to read the whole paragraph? And I emailed back saying, no, that's just impossible. In fact, I don't think you can do it because climate science is complicated. It's nuanced. You can't boil down complicated science to a single line. And so, in a kind of snarky finish, I said, but if you want to do it, you're welcome to have a crack at it. And I thought that would be the end of it. Now, a few weeks later, I got an email from this guy, and the email had a Word attachment, a Word document attached to the email. So he said, I've had a crack, and I've actually written a one-line summary to every debunking on your website. So I opened up the Word document, and he'd done it. And I read through all these one-line rebuttals and thought, actually, I wish I'd thought to say it like that. That's pretty good. And so, so I started to integrate these one-line debunkings into the Skeptical Science website. Now, at the same time that I was corresponding with him, I was also corresponding with a programmer in Sydney who had programmed this thing. He just called it the Twitter bot. I guess there's a lot more of them these days, but back then he'd written some code that scanned Twitter and used some fairly straightforward AI to detect climate myths in tweets. And if it detected a tweet, it would automatically tweet a response. And so I said to him, actually, I've just got this resource, all these one-line responses to the most common myths about climate change. Is this any good to you? And he had a look at it and he emailed back, yeah, these are okay, but can you get them down to 140 characters? So my history as a science communicator on Skeptical Science has been a physical scientist, painfully learning the lessons of science communication, and people suggesting things, me tending to resist it, but being dragged, kicking and screaming into better science communication practices. One of the worst suggestions I got was from a physicist from Sydney at UNSW suggesting, well, he'd just read this blog post that Gavin Schmidt wrote on Real Climate, and Gavin was suggesting that scientists need to communicate at multiple levels, and he used the analogy of ski slopes, having a beginner, an intermediate and an advanced level. And so this physicist was saying, you really should do the same thing with skeptical science. Why don't you just have every debunking at a beginning, intermediate and advanced level? And I emailed back, well, that sounds great. Do you want to help with that? And he was like, no way, you're on your own there. And so I was like, there's no way that could possibly happen. Like, that's just a ridiculous amount of work involved. But the more I thought about it, the more, I guess, compelling the idea was. And it was compelling for two reasons. One was because as a science communicator, one of the things I always struggled with was what level do you write at? If you write at a basic level, it's too, I guess it's too basic for people who are engaged with the issue, which tend to be most of the people who are visiting the Skeptical Science website. But if you write at a higher level, then it's too high for people who are new to the issue. And so it was this kind of stuck in two worlds kind of dilemma. And I could see that if you wrote at those multiple levels, it's like having your cake and eat it too. You can write for multiple audiences at the same time. The other thing was, up to that point, I'd been doing skeptical science for several years, and I'd been trying to get people to help me write all this content and responding to this fire hose of misinformation that seemed to be pouring out onto the internet, and not having any luck. Whenever people would email me and say, I really appreciate what you're doing with skeptical science, every time I'd say, that's great, do you want to help me? And they were like, no, you're on your own. And I could see why, because the idea of writing content from scratch is very intimidating for anyone. But I thought that perhaps a task like this could be a catalyst to recruiting more people to help. So I put this call to action out on the website. I said, I have all these intermediate level rebuttals on skeptical science. Who thinks that they can take this existing content and translate it into plain language rebuttals, and use Gavin's ski slope metaphor as a way of illustrating it. And overnight, dozens of people signed up, obviously thinking they could do a better job than me at explaining climate science. So what I found was suddenly I had all this momentum, all this interest in people writing rebuttals and no way to harness it. So very quickly I put up a forum, created a forum where people could write their basic rebuttals, put them in this forum, and then we could critique it. And then within a week we had dozens of different rebuttals all written, and then we had to find a way to manage all this content. So what we did was we programmed in essentially a peer review system into the forum, where people would read a rebuttal in the forum, either post a comment critiquing it and offering suggestions, or if they thought it was good enough, they'd give it a green thumb. And we found that once a rebuttal got at least half a dozen green thumbs, it was generally good enough for publication. So it's kind of like social media meets peer review, a very quick way of generating high quality information. And then we updated the website. We took Gavin's ski slope visual metaphor and put that in the website. And so now what we have is basic, intermediate and advanced rebuttals of the most common myths about climate change. The basic one has the first line, the one-liners that were sent to me in that original Word document. The intermediate has that paragraph response. And all this content, gradually the website's been evolving and becoming more, more multi-level and I think capable of reaching more audiences. So probably my favourite bit of feedback that I've got from someone who's visited the site was one that involved hardly any work for me. It was some software developers from Melbourne this time. They ran a software media company, and the two owners of the company were really passionate about climate change, and they said, we want to create an iPhone app that takes all the debunkings from skeptical science and puts it in an app so that if someone's at a family get-together and a cranky uncle starts throwing myths at them, or they're just walking down a dark alley and a climate denier jumps out and starts throwing arguments, they can just pull out their phone and look up the answers. And so it was just a matter of providing the information for them. They put it into this app so that now the way it works is you just search for a myth, or just use a keyword. It'll bring up all the relevant myths, and then you can go and it'll show you the debunking. And then you can go in and drill in and look at images, zoom in and see the latest data. And so, yeah, making the science at a content level more accessible, and then at a software level easier for people to access, has been a gradual process. But the ultimate goal just being make climate science and make debunkings more accessible to as many people as possible. So that's kind of for a number of years, probably about 3 or 4 years, that was the level of science communication that I was operating at. Then I received, I think it was about 2010, what in hindsight ended up being, a life-changing email. A cognitive scientist from the University of Western Australia sent me an email with an innocuous-looking attachment. It wasn't a virus or anything, or maybe at a mental level it was a virus, but what he sent me was some psychological research. He said that the way that you're debunking misinformation, well, you probably should look at this paper. And what he sent me was a paper from 2007 about debunking misinformation. And what the research found was if you debunk myths in the wrong way, there's potentially the risk that you can reinforce the myth and actually make things worse than before they even read your debunking. And I looked at the example of the debunking in this research, and the structure of it was almost exactly the same as the structure of the debunkings on the Skeptical Science website. So the headline was the myth, and so all the emphasis was placed on the myth, and the myth was communicated more simply than the long rebuttal and all the scientific information afterwards. So, I mean, as physical scientists, a lot of people involved in climate change who are pretty engaged in the issue, they have that moment where they're reading research and they have that kind of blood draining from your face horror moment where you realise something quite dire in the research. this was that moment for me. Like, I was reading this research, the blood was draining from my face, and I was thinking, have I actually been making things worse for the last couple of years? And I resolved at that point to read as much about the social science research into communication and debunking as possible to find out, firstly, stop making things worse, and rather than doing ineffective science communication, find the most effective ways to communicate. And so, so the first thing I learnt was it's important when you're doing science communication, particularly when you're trying to create belief change or have people update false beliefs. It's important to understand, how do people think about information? And what I learnt was that we all form mental models of how the world works. And I find that this cog metaphor, like a machine, is a nice way of thinking about it. Our mental models are like interlocking parts where A causes B and B causes C. There's lots of causal relationships. It's all interconnected. But what happens when part of that mental model is wrong? It's based on a myth. So what happens if B in the mental model is false? When you tell people, actually, B is false, it's a myth, what you do is you create a gap in their mental model. And people don't like gaps in their mental models. They actually prefer a complete mental model, even if it's less accurate, compared to an incomplete model with gaps in it that's more accurate. And so what research has found is, when you debunk misinformation, if you leave a gap in their mental model, then what happens is the myth comes back and it continues to influence people. And there's been examples where, for example, probably the first research that found this, and it's the most famous research in psychology literature, is the warehouse fire study. They would tell people this story about a warehouse fire and what caused it, and then they would debunk the cause and says, I think it was to do with gas cans, and then they said, actually, there weren't any gas cans in the warehouse. And then later they would ask people questions about what caused it. And they found that people still believed it was the gas cans, even if they remembered and agreed with the retraction. But they found that if they provided an alternative cause of the fire, then they stopped believing in the gas can explanation. It's not enough just to prove that something's wrong. You need to dislodge it with a replacement fact. Another good example I find is a way of understanding this dynamic is other experiments have had mock jury trials. So they'll have the participants in an experiment be told that here is a suspect of a crime, but here is all the evidence exonerating him from the crime. And they find that that's not enough to stop them from, I guess, psychologically exonerating the suspect. It's only when you provide an alternative suspect who fits all the available evidence that they stop believing that the initial suspect is guilty. You need to provide that alternative suspect. And so that's really the key element to debunking misinformation. Identify that replacement fact that dislodges the myth and fills the gap in people's mental model. And so you could really sum up a lot of the research into psychology of debunking with just these 6 words. Fight sticky myths with stickier facts. We need to identify that replacement fact, but then we also have to, it's not enough just to communicate it, we have to try to make the way we communicate our facts as sticky as possible. And I think for brevity, I removed my slide on how you make science sticky. If we have time at the end, maybe I'll come back to it if people are interested. So as I learnt more and more of this research into debunking, I started to restructure the Skeptical Science website. This is what the website looked like in 2007. Then the first step I did, which was quite easy to do, was just replace the headline. Rather than make the headline the myth, I made it that key replacement fact that I wanted people, that I wanted to dislodge the myth with. So put the key fact at the headline. Then I repeated that fact in like the one-line box or the paragraph box, and I put that first above the myth. So it's really start with the myth, repeat the myth, before introducing, let's rewind a little. Start with the facts, repeat the facts, reinforce it before introducing the myth, and then come back to a more detailed explanation of the facts. So it sounds straightforward and simple structure, right? But almost every debunking that, and every fact check that you'll see in newspapers, in fact-checking websites, in government reports that address misinformation, do the opposite of that. They do what I did back in 2007 when I wasn't aware of the social science research. They lead with the myth. They have concise, bold-fonted, colourful articulations of a myth before going into detailed explanations of the facts. And debunking really needs to be flipped opposite and emphasis put on the facts. Oh, I do have that slide. It just got jumbled. So how do we make our science as sticky as possible? I've found that this book, Made to Stick, offers a really useful framework, and I've found that it's been quite useful for me in trying to make my science communication stickier. And what this book does is look at lots of examples of really successful sticky communications, whether it's storytelling or folk stories or advertising campaigns. And they find that messages that go viral, that people remember, share a lot of these 6 characteristics. They're always simple. They often take people by surprise. They need to come from credible sources. They need to be concrete, which is a challenge for climate scientists, because climate change is well, it's actually the opposite of all these things. Often it's emotional, which emotional messages are more likely to be remembered and to be shared. That's a challenge for scientists, because we're trained to kind of bleed the emotion out of everything we do, right? And they tell a story. People remember information in the forms of stories. So if we can take our science and try to match as many of these, tick as many of these boxes as possible, we improve our chances of our science being stickier, more likely to be shared and more likely to be remembered. I'll give you an example. A persistent myth is that global warming stopped in 1998, or it hasn't been happening for the last decade or two. And usually scientists respond to this by talking about statistically significant trends or confidence intervals or complicated statistical mumbo-jumbo that really is none of the 6 sticky characteristics I just listed. And it's not the sticky fact that we need to dislodge the sticky myth that global warming stopped in 1998. So I decided to experiment with one possible sticky way of communicating that global warming has actually continued over the last few decades. And it was by looking at heat content. When you add up the amount of heat building up in our oceans, warming the land, the air, melting the ice, it's about, I think, 250 trillion joules per second, which is equivalent to 4 atomic bombs worth of heat every second. And so I just summarised that in this infographic and published it. And then I was asked to speak at an environmental conference in Sydney one year. And it was almost everyone at this conference were environmentalists, talking about all their cool and edgy campaigns that they'd engaged in. But because it was a conference about climate change, they thought, well, we've got to get a nerd in to talk about the whole reason why we're doing this in the first place. And so I was the nerd who, they just had to get that science out of the way. And so I gave a talk about the science of climate change, about greenhouse effects, showed this slide, talked about carbon cycles and whatnot. And then all the cool speakers got up and talked about all their environmental campaigns. And during all their talks, there was lots of woos and cheers and hollers. There was no woos during my talk. It was just polite silence. I showed all my graphs and then moved on. The next day, a journalist wrote up the conference. And the one thing he focused on was this one slide in the nerd talk at the start of the day. And it wasn't even new science I was publishing. It was just arithmetic. I was just taking existing science that we've known for years and communicating it in as sticky way as possible. But the journalist published it in the Australian, no less, which is the Australian, our country's version of the Wall Street Journal, essentially. And then that was picked up by newspapers all over the world, as if it was new science, but it was just a slide in a nerd's talk. But what I took from this was when we take the effort to make our science as sticky as possible, we're increasing the likelihood that it will go viral, that it'll resonate with people. And so it doesn't guarantee it, but it's kind of like climate change and extreme weather, right? It increases the likelihood that it's going to happen. Going viral there's no magic formula, otherwise people would do that and have guaranteed viral messages. But what you can do is increase your chances that your science will, A, grab attention, B, be remembered, and C, be shared. The problem was, it was also a controversial analogy, and some people didn't like it. They thought it was an emotive analogy, or they thought, wasn't there a different analogy you could use that would be less controversial? And so when I was at AGU a few years ago, I decided, okay, I was being a bit cheeky, but I decided to try a different analogy that should be guaranteed not to offend anyone. So I tried this on as as science communicators, we should be experimenting with different approaches. Like, science communication isn't paint by the numbers. There's an element of creativity as well. And this should be guaranteed to offend no one, right? Wrong. So one blog post calculated the number of kitten sneezes and the number of kittens in the world, worked out how many sneezes each kitten should be making, and based on those calculations, calculated that should vaporize every kitten in the world. And therefore this was actually an even worse analogy than Hiroshima. So anyway, don't be put off by that. Sticky science communication is definitely something that we should all aspire to. But really that's only half the story too. And so I think if that's the first half of what I wanted to talk about, the second half is that while we should aspire to try to make our science as sticky as possible, that's not enough either, which is kind of a discouraging thought, but I think it leads to some positive outcomes. And the reason why, I guess there's a number of studies that indicate why, but the one I find clearest is an experiment published last year by George Mason University, done before I got there. What they did was they tested what happens when people receive different types of messages. One of the messages was communicating the 97% consensus among climate scientists, which has been found in a number of studies to be one of the stickiest ways to communicate human-caused global warming. So that was one message that they tested. Another message they tested was this is actually, they didn't use this article, but this article was the most shared climate article in social media in 2016. And what the article basically argued was there's no scientific consensus on climate change because 30,000 scientists have signed this petition saying that humans aren't disrupting climate. So you have these two messages. There's 97% consensus, there's no consensus. They tested what happened when people received one or other or both of these messages. So this is the results. The left one is what happened when people were told about the 97% consensus. And they found it had a strong positive effect. It's a sticky message. It's one of the stickiest messages you could communicate about climate change and one of the simplest. They found that when people were told just the misinformation by itself, that it had a negative effect and statistically significant. So that tells us misinformation does work. And it's one of the effects of misinformation is it can cause people to believe wrong things. But the third column is the really interesting one. This is what happened when people were presented both the 97% consensus and the misinformation about consensus. And they found that they cancel each other out. And this has big consequences for anyone involved in science communication because it means that it's not enough for us to make our science sticky and just stick to communicating the science because all that work can be undone by misinformation. We really ignore the negative impacts of misinformation and climate denial at our own peril. And the sad, like I don't think I have data on this, but like what we're seeing in content analysis of of articles from conservative think tanks and blogs is that climate misinformation is actually on the increase. It's not going away. It's actually having a resurgence at the moment. So the misinformation isn't going quietly into the night, and what this data tells us is that it has a potential to undo our attempts at science communication and science education. So what's happening here with this third bar? What's happening when people are presented with conflicting pieces of information? Probably 90% of the people in this room won't have watched this show, but what's happening is a lot like these old Star Trek episodes where Captain Kirk gets cloned, and there's the original Captain Kirk and there's the evil clone of Captain Kirk, and Mr. Spock has to try to work out which is the real Kirk and which is the evil fake Kirk. When people are presented with conflicting pieces of information, they often struggle. They don't know how to tell which is real and which is fake. And in those situations, the easiest thing to do is just disengage and stop believing in the facts. And so that's really, I think, one of the biggest dangers of misinformation. Not that it causes people to believe wrong things, but it can just stop people believing in facts altogether. And there's a big asymmetry. Misinformation doesn't need to be coherent or based on evidence or even convincing. It just needs to exist, and that can cause people to stop believing in facts. So what do we do about that? So what they explored in this research is a branch of psychological theory called inoculation theory. And this takes the idea of vaccination and applies it to knowledge. So what they found was if you expose people to a weak form of misinformation, then that helps them build up immunity so that when they encounter the actual misinformation, they don't get influenced. So it's exactly the same as being exposed to a weak form of a virus through the form of like a flu shot, and that builds up immunity, so when you encounter the actual virus, you don't get infected. 50 years of research doing inoculation experiments have found that this works in the case of knowledge just the same as it does with viruses and vaccination. So what do I mean by a weak form of misinformation? There's two elements to an inoculation. One, and this is actually the most important part, is warning people of the threat that they might be misled. And secondly, explaining the techniques used to mislead people, or providing counter-arguments that debunk the misinformation. So in the case of this experiment where they were trying to inoculate people against this petition of 31,000 scientists, this is just an excerpt from their inoculation text, but they basically pointed out that because it was an online petition, many of the people who signed it weren't real. There was Star Wars characters, there were Spice Girls, there were characters from MASH. They pointed out that 31,000 sounds like a lot of people, but this was 31,000 people with a science degree. There were millions of people in the US with a science degree, so it's a tiny fraction of the available science graduates. And lastly, 99.9% of the people of these 31,000 signatories had no expertise in climate science. They were anyone with a science degree, so it was people with a computer science degree or medical science or engineering, but very few, tiny fraction, like 0.1%, actually had expertise in climate change. So what they found was when people were inoculated before receiving the misinformation, it neutralised most of the negative effect of the misinformation and allowed the facts to take an effect. So George Mason were running this study, and at the same time I was in Australia running my own PhD experiments, and coincidentally I was using the same misinformation. I took verbatim from the Global Warming Petition Project website the actual petition and the statement that 31,000 scientists, or more accurately people with a science degree, have signed this dissenting statement. And this was what I found when people were presented with just the misinformation. And the horizontal axis in this graph is political ideology. So as you get more to the right, people are more right-wing. And what I found was the more conservative people were, the more effect climate misinformation had in lowering their acceptance of climate change. So this doesn't apply to all types of misinformation, but at least in the case of climate misinformation, it had a disproportionate effect on people who are politically conservative compared to people who are politically liberal. And it also means that misinformation, climate misinformation, polarizes. It causes the population to spread further apart. And I also had an inoculation in my experiment, but I took a different approach. I didn't even mention the misinformation, the 31,000 petition project. I just talked about the technique used to mislead people, the technique of fake experts. People who had conveyed the impression that they were experts, but actually had no relevant expertise. And I found that even without mentioning that specific misinformation, explaining the technique used to mislead was effective in completely neutralising the misinformation. So the blue line was a change in belief after being inoculated, and it was essentially zero. But the interesting thing that I find in this data is that it worked across the political spectrum. Whether you're liberal or conservative, no one likes to be misled. So explaining the techniques used to mislead people neutralises misinformation regardless of political ideology. So how do you come up with inoculations? Practically, how do you create an inoculation text? And the key to that is critical thinking. There's a quote I read which I really like that characterises critical thinking. It's like X-ray vision into thinking. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Here's a quote from Senator Rubio from the Republican primaries. When asked about climate change and whether he would endorse climate action, his response was, well, you can see it. One of the reasons why climate is changing is because climate has always been changing. And what critical thinking does is it allows you to deconstruct arguments and really get to the heart of what he's arguing. And basically, deconstructing an argument means breaking it up into what are the starting assumptions or premises and what is the conclusion. In this case, the premises are climate has changed in the past through natural processes, climate is changing now, and therefore the conclusion, therefore it must be natural now as well. And by breaking up an argument into its logical structure, that allows you to identify where, if anywhere, does an argument commit a logical fallacy. And so just on Monday, actually, we just published a paper that took this critical thinking approach and we developed it into a set of, a set of steps you can go through to deconstruct and analyse arguments. And it was published in Environmental Research Letters. So if you're interested in having a look at this, the URL, there's a short URL which will redirect you to the actual paper. And here's a very simplified version of the steps. Once you construct the argument, you have your premises and you can check whether it's logically valid. If it's not logically valid, like the one we just saw, then the argument is false. If it is valid, then the next step is check whether the premises are true. And then again, if any of the premises are false, that also helps you to see where the argument goes wrong, if anywhere. And so what we did was that we took that approach and we applied it to 42 of the most common myths about climate change and basically identified any fallacies or one or more fallacies in each of the arguments. And these were 42 arguments that argued against mainstream climate science, and surprise, surprise, we found that all of them contain logical flaws, and we just listed them in the paper. So pulling all of this together, I think you can summarise all the research in this one slide. If you are responding to misinformation, there's really three elements that you need to include in your debunking or in your response. Firstly, lead with the facts, identify that replacement fact that dislodges the myth. Secondly, you do need to mention the myth, but warn people before you do, even if it's just one myth states that, because that puts people cognitively on guard, so they're less likely to be influenced by the myth. And then thirdly, once you've presented these two conflicting pieces of information, fact and myth, you need to help people resolve the conflict. And you do that by explaining the technique that the myth uses to distort the facts. We've took that approach, this fact-myth fallacy structure, and we've applied it in a MOOC, a massive open online course about climate science denial. And what the MOOC does is it's basically 50 7-minute videos. Each video takes that fact-myth fallacy structure, and it leads with a fact, then it introduces a relevant myth, and then explains the fallacy that the myth uses. And so it's a way to communicate the key facts about climate change, but also inoculate people against 50 of the most common myths about climate change. So we're boosting climate literacy, but we're also increasing people's critical thinking skills. I want to leave some time for Q&A, but I'm going to very quickly, this is my last little pitch, and I want to talk about some research I'm currently working on right now. Now, one of the, I guess, problems with climate change and misinformation is that the effort that we have to go to debunk myths is way greater than the effort it takes for someone just to tweet a myth or just blurt out a myth or post it on a comment. And there's a real asymmetry there. It takes so much effort to write and publish debunkings. But I've been thinking about the fact that it also takes a lot of effort to build a car, right? Just imagine if we all were to build a car in the middle of this room, right? That would take a huge amount of effort, right? It would be really difficult. But these days, through automation, we can churn out cars at an incredible rate, and automation has made the effort so much easier than in the past. What I'm researching is taking that idea of automation and trying to apply it to misinformation. And so the project we're doing is trying to train a machine to automatically detect misinformation about climate change. And it's based on the idea that the myths that we're seeing in 2018 are the same myths that we saw in 1990. We have 20, 30 years of climate misinformation, and it's the same, it's static, it hasn't changed. And so that means that you can take all this content and train a machine to identify certain texts with certain types of myths. And if you do it enough, the machine should be able to detect this information in real time going into the future. So the process is pretty straightforward. It's look at a paragraph of text and then map it to a specific myth. The problem is it takes climate literacy to do it. We've tried it with undergrads who didn't have any climate literacy, and they were awful at it. Then we tried it with the skeptical science team, and they were really good at it. But they're a relatively small group who are getting cranky with me because I keep cracking the whip on trying to go read tens of thousands of paragraphs to train this machine. So I guess my pitch is I'm looking for people who have enough climate literacy to read a blog post about climate change and understand what it is. And if you have that skill, then, and you're interested in helping, I guess, this next stage of responding to climate misinformation, then get in touch with me. There's my email address, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone afterwards, or email me and we can discuss. I can answer any questions about how this works and how they could learn more. So so hopefully we've got some time for Q&A, but thanks for the opportunity to talk.
We have time for questions.
Yeah.
Fire it up.
So this seems like the kind of thing that social scientists would have been studying for a very long time. And now maybe the climate instance of it is a new element. Or is there really new social science going on?
Inoculation has been happening since, inoculation theory has been researched since the 1950s. But the first study to apply that to climate misinformation was 2017. And the second was mine a few months later. So applying it to climate change is new. What I find, and this I think applies to all misinformation research, is most of the research has been focused on diagnosing the problem and relatively little has been on coming up with solutions to it. And so that's really my focus now, is coming up with not only theoretical solutions, but actually putting it into practice. And so, yeah, it's coming up with real practical solutions is challenging, but it's what we need to resolve this issue in the real world. Yes?
How do you avoid like a Twitter bot war where you have the
Right.
you know, the good guys and the bad guys, and it's just an escalation of trying to attack and counterattack?
Because I think that's how the Terminator movie started, right? I mean, that's possible. Like, I think that, like, a common question I get asked is, all these principles of communication couldn't, you know, opponents of climate action and people who deny climate science, couldn't they use these principles themselves, you know, to cast doubt on climate change and climate science? And the answer is yes, and they've been doing it for decades, and they've often been doing it long before we've been doing it. So I think that in some ways, while we've been pouring our efforts into understanding climate science, they've been pouring their efforts into how do we confuse the public about climate science, because they don't have to understand climate science, they just have to confuse. It's another one of those asymmetrical challenges. Like, everyone here is spending, you know, 95% of their time doing climate science. They don't have that workload. They can just spend all their effort on communication and PR. So I think that there's always a possibility that our efforts will be countered with, you know, sort of similar strategies, I guess. But alternatively, if we're not doing if our communication isn't based on scientific research, then we're doing, like, the alternative is to do less, like, ineffective science communication. So I don't really see that we have a choice but to go where the science tells us.
It seems like, obviously, we've got climate change misinformation, but misinformation is everywhere in all topics, vaccinations or anything else. Ideally, what we want is a population that can do these things that you talk about, that can recognize the false arguments. Do you get a sense that we're teaching that at school or beyond? Is that something we need to start incorporating more into what we help students do?
All the principles that I've outlined here would apply to any form of misinformation. And so it's actually my hope that if this machine learning project works for climate change, it can be the methodology can be taken and translated to other areas. And similarly, the approach that we use with fact myth fallacies and inoculation can be applied to other topics as well. And in fact, we're designing experiments at George Mason which takes exactly the same inoculation approach and does it in 3 different unrelated topics to see whether it does work in exactly the same way. And yeah, so the answer is yes, but further we're digging deeper into, there's probably nuances and there's probably variations across topics. For example, climate change, the biggest predictors of rejection of climate science is political affiliation and political ideology. With vaccination, there's not as much of a relationship with political ideology. And so there's different dynamics there. So how inoculation works, if the drivers of denial are different, will be interesting to see. Yeah?
I was wondering if age had any impact on, or if you, I mean, because most studies are done on college age students because of the availability, but if age has an impact on people's willingness to see misinformation or the effectiveness of inoculation.
Yeah. That's a good question, and I think the general answer is yes, it's more effective with younger people. Like that initial research about the backfire effect you get, like that very first study that put the emphasis on the myth first rather than the facts, they found that mostly worked with older people rather than younger people. And they they suggested that maybe memory was an issue, like a week later. I'm not trying to be offensive or anything. This is just science, right? But they suggested that what could be happening was over time the details fade, and so all they would remember was the clear, strong, bold headline. But a caveat I'll put is that research, other researchers have tried to replicate it, and they've struggled to replicate there being a backfire effect. Nevertheless, so maybe skeptical science wasn't making things worse after all, but it wasn't being as effective as it was. So the principle of putting emphasis on the facts still holds, and the principle that inoculations or debunkings are more effective with younger people seems to be robust. But even that underscores the importance of sticky science communication. Make it as simple and memorable as possible, and hopefully that, I'm just speculating now, but I imagine that will probably mitigate age problems. Yes?
Do other countries have this problem, or is it just America?
You'll be happy to know that it's not just America. The countries where climate denial is strongest are, and see if you can see a pattern here, America, Canada, Australia, England, and New Zealand. So, and I haven't seen any study that kind of examines this quantitatively, but what I see in common, obviously the Anglo countries, but I think that Murdoch media is a strong presence in all these countries. And so I think, what, didn't everyone notice that? And so I think that generation of misinformation and dissemination of misinformation through mass media is one of the drivers of climate denial. It allows it to flourish. Not flourish, exist. And let me just caveat that, because there is this perception that climate denial is a much bigger proportion of the populace than it really is. In America, people who are dismissive of climate change are around 9%. In Australia, it's around 7%. But when you ask people, how many people do you think are dismissive of climate change? The answer is usually around 30%. So people think that the proportion of people dismissive of climate change is about 3 times bigger than it really is. So this is a misconception that actually has big consequences. When you look at the American population, 52% of them are, like more than half, are either alarmed or concerned about climate change. But most of these alarmed, concerned people don't talk about climate change with their friends and family. And the reason why is a thing called pluralistic ignorance. They don't realise that they're in the majority. They think that deniers are a much bigger proportion of the populace than they really are. And that if they talk up about climate change, they're going to receive pushback. This happens with people in personal conversations. We see this in our own survey data of TV meteorologists who don't talk about climate change on TV because they're worried about pushback from their viewers. And one simple way to try to end this climate silence is just by what I've just done, like debunk the misconception that deniers are a big proportion of the population. They're small but a very vocal minority. Yes?
I'm part of a student organization called Climate Media, and this past week we actually just launched a climate change meme page on Instagram.
Meme page?
Memes, yeah, and then like pictures and videos that are really simple that we're trying to make go viral. And basically we want to try to simplify information to a level even simpler than that on your website, so that young people can just spread it and start talking about climate change more. Eventually we want to use actual data and things like Yale climate maps and turn them into memes so people all over the internet can see them. I want your input on how we can do this without creating inaccuracies and without maybe offending everybody in this department.
Well, I think that as my earlier anecdotes about the atomic bomb metaphor and the kitten sneeze metaphor showed, I think that it's probably impossible to not offend anyone, right? Like to offend no one. And I actually came across a quote this last week which I really liked. When you say words of consequence, there will be consequences. But the alternative is to be inconsequential. I think that if we want to do science communication that has impact, there's going to be pushback. And I found that the most impactful science communication that I've done has always resulted in pushback. And the more impactful, the stronger the pushback. So firstly, put aside the notion that you can do real science communication that actually moves the needle and not get some pushback. I think the idea of memes is a great idea. I think that definitely the more people you can get involved in helping crowdsource and generate it, the better. And the idea of communicating the science in a simple, sticky way, that is a challenge. And it's almost, as science communicators, you have to make a decision on where on the spectrum between complicated and simple you want to position yourself. Because the more you go towards the simple end of the spectrum, the more you do open yourself up to criticism. Because as you get simpler, it's harder to, I guess, capture all the nuance and the accuracy of the actual scientific world. When I started doing skeptical science, I would write these intermediate rebuttals, and I would caveat them. It would be almost a legal document. I could see where I would get attacked potentially, and so I would put in some qualifying text to make sure to block off that line of attack. And I found that my rebuttals would just be overladen with caveats and qualifiers, and I might be bulletproof from attack, but the text was so dense that it would be ineffective as a piece of science communication. So I gradually made the decision to try to communicate as simply as possible, knowing that it did expose me to the potential of being criticised, but that was just a decision that I was willing to make. But not everyone is willing to do that. I guess it's a personal decision. One last thing I'll say is inoculation really lends itself to memes because explaining the techniques of denial, this whole logical thing with premises and conclusions and fallacies, it's all kind of fancy pants critical thinking philosophy stuff. And in an ideal world, we would have people do 6-month philosophy courses to understand logic and assessments of arguments. But a really elegant way to achieve all that same thing without all the training, and sometimes without even having to explain all the complicated science, is just through the use of parallel arguments. Take the logic of a bad argument and translate it into a different context just to show how ridiculous the argument is. So Marco Rubio's climate's changing the past, therefore what's happening natural. It's equivalent to seeing a dead body slumped over with a big knife coming out of his back and saying, people have died of natural causes in the past, therefore this person must have died of natural causes. The logic is exactly the same, but put it in a different context, people can instantly see the flaw without having to explain paleoclimate and all the complicated climate science. And that's something you can easily put into a meme. Yes?
So among well-meaning science communicators or climate communicators, there's this thing bubbling up I've noticed lately, which is that, okay, people are getting it, but it's depressing to them, so it's paralyzing them. So we need to, yes, maybe a majority believe in it now, but we have to stop talking about the bad stuff and give them solutions.
Right.
So I'm wondering if there's research on that. I mean, if you dislodge a negative, falsehood with a negative truth, are you really, in the end, yes, it's critical to have that critical thinking, but are you making a difference? Part of me is a skeptic in many ways, feels like you can't get rid of that negative truth telling. You've got
there is, not only in environmental communication, but in like health risk communication as well. What they find is you really need two elements to risk communication. You need to warn people of the problem, but you also need to give them positive solutions. Like you need to give them a path, some action they can do to fix it. Because if you only give the problem, that paralyzes people. If they don't have a path, an action they can do to resolve the problem. But if you only give them the solutions, then it lacks the urgency that the science dictates. So it's not one or the other. You have to present problem and solution.
Okay. Well, we want to thank you very much for coming here today. Celebrate the SS. Winter